Um, he doesn't need any introduction, except to say that he was the leader of the very first delegation from this country that went, it was a delegation of supporters of the revolution that went to Grenada just within weeks of the US invasion. He is, in fact, technically still the president of Committee for Human Rights in Grenada, although he may not remember that. But we're very, very happy to have you with us, Jeremy, and to make your contribution. Thank you very much for participating.
Thank you very much. Sorry I'm a bit late getting on. I was just rushing back home to be able to get on. It took a bit longer than I thought it might. First of all, I've missed some of the earlier contributions, but I was just listening to Earl there. And before I say anything about the visit to Grenada in 1983, I think the words he used, spiritual beings are all of us, and the need for families to be able to have their deceased loved ones buried near them is something that's very, very important. And he's quite right that many Caribbean families spend a great deal of money paying for older relatives who've passed away in Britain to go home to be buried in Jamaica, in Trinidad, Barbados, or any of the other islands in the Caribbean. And the idea that 37 years on, these bodies have still not been returned, and the families haven't got that knowledge that their loved ones are buried near them is something that is utterly disgraceful. And I'm pleased to join this call today and support that call that those bodies are returned home. As Jean was saying, I was one of the people that went on a delegation in 1983, just after the invasion by the United States, and I went with Bernie Grant, Nadine Finch, and a whole lot of other people. And it was very educating, illuminating experience for me, not least because we met some wonderful people who were going through a trauma following the US invasion, who were obviously very stressed by the whole thing. We were pursued wherever we went by Daily Mail journalists, to the extent we even went in the sea one day and a Daily Mail journalist appeared through the waves to demand how I got there. There were many tempting thoughts ran through many people's heads while they were doing this, because they weren't remotely interested in the justice or injustice of the people of Grenada. They just wanted to have a go at Bernie and me, which we didn't give them the pleasure of being able to do that. We also observed the US soldiers and their activities, and I've never forgotten going to the airport which the Cuban construction workers had been building. And as we went to it, we went through the bare buildings of the airport that hadn't yet been fitted out, but they were usable in the sense that they were walls and a roof. And it was absolutely full of GIs who were waiting to go home with their massive packs and big guns and everything else. And they were sort of resting against their packs, but ready to go on a transport plane to go home. And they were reading comics. And to me, this was slightly odd, very odd. They weren't individually unpleasant to us or even particularly hostile. They were kind of slightly confused as to who we were and what we were doing there, but they didn't individually give us any trouble. And then, so we left them to it, and we then went to the barracks area where the Cuban construction workers had been housed. And it was like they'd left 10 minutes ago. It was like sort of half-drunk cups of refreshment by their beds, and things just left behind. They'd left in an enormous hurry, and books had been left behind. And I've never forgotten, beside one bed, there was a book of the poetry of Jose Marti and a book in Spanish of the complete works of Shakespeare. So you had Cuban construction workers in a barracks reading poetry and reading great works of literature like Shakespeare, and you had the invading force with all the weapons in the world reading comics 100 meters away. It was a very strange experience. And we met the then imposed governor, Paul Scoon, and raised a lot of questions about how the order had come for the invasion, what consultations there had been with the British government, which he was very unkeen on answering, and particularly unkeen because he had a British Army officer as his assistant who was very unsubtle with intervening to say the Governor General cannot speak of this, cannot speak of that, and cannot speak of a lot of other things. But we made the demands on them, that we wanted to know what had happened. We also made the demands that those people in prison, Bernard Cord and others, should not face a death penalty and that they should be released. They weren't released until many, many years later, but when he was released, Bernard Cord came to my office in Parliament and explained what had happened because of our visit. I didn't know any of that at the time. He said the attitude changed a great deal after Bernie and I had gone there and made our representations. I was inspired by the Grenadian Revolution. I was inspired by the works of Maurice Bishop. I was inspired by what the revolution was achieving self-respect for the Caribbean, achieving justice for the people of the Caribbean. And then you think about it, why did the Americans have to invade Grenada? Could they, even in their wildest dreams, believe that somehow or other Grenada was a military threat to the United States? Because in the same year, I went to Nicaragua in 1983, and I met the US Senator Pete Wilson, who was visiting at the time, and he was a great friend of Reagan. And I said to him, why is the USA so hostile to Nicaragua? And he said, because it's an ever-present military threat to the USA. And indeed, I later saw a Heritage Foundation film which had with it sort of with suitable graphics of the 1980s of uprisings in Central America, which suddenly translated into a column of tens of thousands, if not millions of soldiers marching from Central America on Washington. It was absurd, it was crazy, it was mad. But unfortunately, the Americans actually believed this stuff, or some of them did, and that's why they had the Contra, why they had Big Pine 2, why they had the sanctions against Nicaragua. And it's that whole aspect of US policy. They had to defeat people who were a threat, not a military threat. There was no military threat, never was. A threat of example. An example that you can provide healthcare, you can provide education, you can provide liberation of people's minds from a colonial mindset. And that is what it was all about. And that inspiration to me has never gone away. And so I'm pleased that we're having this call, and I'm pleased that you did me the honor of electing me to that great position in the Human Rights in Grenada Committee. And I hope that in memory of those that died, in memory of all of those lives that were lost, and in amazement at what was achieved during those few short years of providing hope, of inspiration, of education, of health, of development, and away from the colonial mindset, will live on and inspire others in the future, as to what is possible in societies that have gone through colonialism. I'll just finish with this thought. This year, above all years, Black Lives Matter's movement, it is a movement, has taken off. It's not a new movement, it's been around for a while, but it's taken off because of the brutality in plain sight of the murder of George Floyd by police in Minnesota. And all around the world, people have seen those that are up against it, indigenous communities in many parts of the world, people that have been discriminated against in their societies for decades, if not centuries, have seen in Black Lives Matters something of themselves. And it's inspired people in so many ways and so many places. And this is Black History Month. I want us not to just have Black History Month. As I said in Parliament last week, I want Black history taught all the time. I want our children to understand the slave trade was not abolished by an act of Parliament by some well-meaning people in Britain. It was abolished by people that rose up against it and paid for their uprising with their lives. Those that led the slave uprisings in almost every island in the Caribbean and all over the Americas. Those that died after Morant Bay, those that died after Western Jamaica, those that died of many other places. And I quoted Sam Sharp in my speech to Parliament last week. I want our children and our grandchildren to understand that the ending of one of the grossest disfigurations of human history, the Atlantic slave trade, was ended by the bravery and the deaths of many of those that led those uprisings. And some great books been written about it. But a great friend of mine, Remy Capo, wrote a wonderful book about Forgotten Harvest, about the sugar industry, and the way in which the sugar traders and dealers in London met and were alarmed at the lack of money they were making because the sugar wasn't getting through because of the slave uprisings. It was the economic pressure on them that led to Parliament ending the slave trade, but tragically paying so much compensation to the slave owners that compensation was only finally paid off in 2015. So there's an awful big weight of history on all of this. But our campaign is for decency, is to have those bodies returned, and is to recall with admiration all those that contributed to the hope that was the revolution in Grenada. Jean, thank you very much. And again, I apologize for not being on the call at the very beginning, as I should have been.